Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here at the second panel of today of our conference, Exposing Crimes is Not a Crime. And this panel is very close to our art at the Disruption Network Club, and not only at the Disruption Network Club, should be close to the heart of everyone, because we will hear stories of people that also, thanks to their courage, they brought to light a lot of information. We are speaking about the panel related to cyber surveillance and intelligence, and there will be many whistleblowers in this panel that you will hear today. And we at this Disruption Network Club have been working often with whistleblowers, bringing them at our conferences, and it's very important and also touching to have them here. And I was discussing also outside with some people of the public, and it was very interesting to have these comments by saying, in the previous panel, we discussed documents, a lot of facts and information that are helping us to understand the present, but there are also stories of lives behind this, and lives that then get a consequence of doing certain acts. There are collateral damage also on the people. But still, even if, and with the story of Julian Assange, we had the example, the persecution is really high, it's still very important to fight for the truth and also have the courage to do so. So I feel that we really have to honor the presence of these people today with us in Berlin, because it's something very rare also to have extraordinary voices all together in a panel in connection with the work of WikiLeaks and also beyond, because through them we can understand a lot about the present and also understand a lot about the future. And now I'm also happy to introduce the moderator that you already got to know him yesterday at the panel, The Reasons Behind, Chip Gibson. So he will join us here. He's a journalist and a researcher. He's the policy director at Defending Rights and Dissents, and also co-author of the Daniel Ellsberg Press Freedom and Whistleblower Protection Acts, that is reforming the Espionage Act to prevent its use and abuse against whistleblower journalists and also the American public. Also, I want to mention that he's authoring a book that will be out in November, The Imperial Bureau, the FBI Political Surveillance, and the Rise of the US National Security State. So I welcome Chip Gibson here as moderator and all these wonderful panelists that we will hear from now. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chip Gibbons, as you just heard, and I'm going to be moderating tonight's panel. I was not the original moderator, but it was an immense honor to be invited to do this. When I was asked to fill in, I took one look at who was on the panel, and I said, of course, I will be on a panel with 4 people whom I admire very, very deeply. This includes Terry Albury, who is a former FBI counterterrorism agent who witnessed firsthand mechanisms of the power executive from within, and whose leak revealed systematic profiling and surveillance tactics deployed on journalists, vulnerable and marginalized communities. He was prosecuted under the Espionage Act and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Thomas Drake, a former senior executive of the National Security Agency, blew the whistle on 9/11 intelligence failures, massive multi-billion fraud, abuse, as well as a secret mass surveillance regime authorized by President Bush that violated the Constitution. He was the signature Espionage Act prosecution of the Obama administration, the first of many to come. And a very important detail about Tom's biography is that we first met in 2013 at a fundraiser for Chelsea Manning. I think it was at Georgetown Law School in DC, and Tom has not been able to get me out of his life since then. And then we have Katharine Gun, the only panelist I've not met before, but who I admire very deeply, and she is a former translator and Mandarin language specialist at GCHQ, the UK Intelligence and Security Agency. She is renowned for leaking a top-secret NSA document in 2003, which was published in The Observer. The email revealed the U.S. intended to spy on 6 United Nations member states in order to justify the war in Iraq and create a Security Council resolution authorizing the attack. And then we have Andy Müller-Maguhn, who is a privacy and security expert and vice president of the Holland Foundation. In 2010, he met Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, after which the foundation began collecting donations for Assange's legal defense following a boycott by several banks and credit card companies. Okay, so we're going to talk about cyber surveillance and WikiLeaks, but I want to open up with 2 very sort of broad questions to set the tone for tonight's panel. 3 of the panelists are whistleblowers, and I just want to start with you, Tom, and then Terry and Katharine. What made you decide to become a whistleblower? What was it that drove you to that point?
I had a moment of truth in which I was confronted by the reality that my own government was violating the Constitution. I had taken an oath, and this was for the 5th time in my government military career, to do what? Support and defend a piece of paper. That's all, piece of paper. Against who? All enemies, foreign and domestic. And I found myself defending the Constitution against my own government.
Terry, would you like to go next?
Sure. Great answer, too, by the way. You know, I've thought about this question a lot over the years. You know, I think there's sort of a combination of events that motivate any person in a situation like this, where you are confronted with such criminality on a massive scale. As Tom mentioned, you know, you join these organizations and you take what they call an oath of office. And part of that is, you know, they expect you to swear allegiance to the institution, but the reality is that no institution is bigger than the people that it serves. And so, you know, as I spent my many years in the FBI and, again, daily witness a lot of these criminal activities, you know, I was forced to confront my own conscience and ask myself sort of what is my role here and what kind of person do I want to be, what kind of world do I want to live in. And so as the years progressed, I made a choice and decided to take the action. Again, you know, as they say, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and a lot of those giants are people like Assange and Daniel Ellsberg and Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, right, who were part of these systems of power and oppression, and they chose to hold those systems accountable. So there you go.
And then Katharine, this one is for you.
Well, I didn't have a long career in the services like you two. I was working at GCHQ about 8 months before 9/11 happened, and I left virtually 2 weeks before the war in Iraq. So it wasn't a long career at all. But and unlike your experiences, the one thing that triggered me was that one email that I saw. So it was just one email in the course of, you know, about two years of work. One email that pulled the curtains away from, you know, made me see behind the curtains, as it were, the machinations of the US government in the United Nations Security Council, how they were going about trying to undermine and corrupt the democratic process to achieve an illegal war, which was the illegal invasion of Iraq. And that email asking for GCHQ's assistance to bug the domestic and office communications of the UN Security Council members was just the red line that I refused to cross, because I thought if the public knew about this this machination behind the scene, this manipulation of the democratic process in order to achieve an illegal war, I thought that would maybe slow down or derail the war entirely. So that was why I acted as I did.
Thank you for that. So Andy, you come at this from a different perspective from the other panelists. You yourself have been a victim of surveillance. What has been the impact of that on your life?
Yeah, that's not so easy to answer, but I, for example, initiated some meetings about an upcoming WikiLeaks publications, the spy files. We had collected quite some presentations and material from companies worldwide who provided their services to kleptocracies, to governments worldwide. And our meeting was in London in a university building. We were sitting there studying material and so on. Then the fire alarm went off. We all had to leave the building running directly into the cameras of the British police, who was like happy to have us each one by one. It was like a small exit, so we had to. I mean, that's just a small scene that gives you an idea of how working around the topic of surveillance was. Now, I probably could write a book about it, but I think it's important to mention that there is a cultural difference between European democracies and even England. And that is, I'm coming from the German hacker scene. We also had our struggles with companies, with governments and so on. But when we spotted someone, a spook, a governmental guy from the German intelligence, interior or whatever, watching us, and we would make a photo of him, he would usually back off. That's not good for someone who's doing covert surveillance to, have his picture taken and so on. But in the UK, it's quite the opposite. We had this guy spotting us, we looked at them, we made pictures, and they started to look with their body language, super aggressive. And we realized that they have this thing called intimidation surveillance, or you might have the more precise terminology from your FBI experience, or you might have experienced it then in England and so on. Where it is not, you're doing nothing illegal, but they can still punish you by investigating against you, by throwing shit in your way, by making your life miserable. And the intimidation aspect often is not so much about you as maybe an activist working in the field and knowing, okay, well, I'm dealing here with surveillance. Of course, there will be people interested in this, but about your social surrounding that get scared shitless because they are not used for the circumstances. So the spectrum of this whole thing is wide. And now Thomas, for example, comes from an environment where it's more like strategic surveillance. That's, again, a total different thing than tactical surveillance. So I think I would kindly ask your question slightly more precise before I answer too long.
No, that was a great answer, and it's very interesting you brought up intimidation surveillance. As a historian of the FBI, intimidation surveillance has been an FBI tactic since, I think, at least 1920. On the one hand, the FBI wants to keep its program secret. On the other hand, they want particularly activists to feel like they're being watched, to the point where there was an infamous FBI memo that was published. It was created as part of the FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTEL program. It's one of the more notorious surveillance abuses in the U.S. And as part of it, they published a memo that said they wanted, in order to neutralize anti-war activity and disrupt it, to make every activist feel like there is an FBI agent behind every mailbox, their exact words. So even though we have this clandestine surveillance, there is a at least in the US, maybe in the UK, there is a deliberate policy of making people feel like they're being surveilled. Speaking of the FBI, I want to talk to Terry. So Andy has talked about what the impact of surveillance has been like to receive it. I know in some of the interviews you've done about your sort of turning against the FBI, you've talked about what you saw as the impact on the communities that were being surveilled. Would you want to talk a little bit about the human impact of surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, it's massive, right? And I think one thing we have to sort of confront historically in the case of the FBI and, in your historical analysis and the book that you're writing, there's been a template that the FBI has used over the years. Go back to its founding in 1908 and sort of the groups that it targeted, the activist labor movement. Fast forward a few years, they target other dissidents, move up to the 60s, the Black Panther, Black Liberation movement, animal rights activists. Fast forward even more to the post 9/11 era and the war on terrorism. And so, the impact is sort of this really aggressive state-sponsored oppression on a massive scale that is rationalized with a very distorted view of patriotism, on who belongs, who deserves to have citizenship in this experiment that we call a country or a democracy. And so oftentimes, and Stella mentioned this yesterday, and that was very poignant, discussing sort of the canary in the coal mine in terms of how the FBI functions and their tactics. The canary has evolved over the years, right? Again, let's go back 30, 40 years. Black liberation groups. There was a very clear method of attacking and weaponizing the law. And unfortunately, certain communities look the other way because it doesn't pertain to us, right? That's them, it's not us, right? Fast forward again, post 9/11, the Muslim community. We're in this whole era of, well, every Muslim's a terrorist, allegedly, right? And so we justify these actions and these tools and weaponize really egregious actions by the state in order to give us a feeling of safety. Today we have Donald Trump in the White House, and so people are having this reckoning like, well, this is happening now to all of us, right? You saw recently in Minnesota with ICE and their tactics, a nurse was shot, a woman driving away from a protest with her child in the car was shot. And these are all sort of the same counterterrorism tactics used by the FBI and their minions to go after those that they deem to be a threat. And so I think we have to really broaden our collective understanding of what it means to be a community of people committed to, our shared humanity and the importance of living in a world that represents us all, regardless of, the differences, right? Whether it's gender or race or religion or any of these sort of arbitrary things, and really expand what it means to be human on this planet. So,
I think you made a really good point. I think you made a really good point about looking the other way. The U.S. really first confronts its surveillance state after Watergate. There's a number of other scandals, but Watergate is the big one because you have Nixon spying on his mainstream opposition. And it's impossible to ignore the fact that the people who were involved in Watergate were veterans of the CIA and the FBI, and that the tactic they used, a break-in, was a tactic that the FBI used regularly. And sort of after that, when we're reckoning with sort of the larger surveillance state, we learned they're spying on small left-wing groups like the Socialist Workers' Party. And the Socialist Workers' Party actually puts out a pamphlet saying, you know, you can't tolerate spying on us and object to Watergate, because one will always lead to the other. And I think we now see with the people who have looked the other way, with the surveillance state coming after Muslim communities, supporters of Palestine, things like that, who are now horrified by what Trump is doing. But Trump is building off of what was already being done. Nixon was building off of what was already being done. Tom, the NSA is a very different type of surveillance agency than the FBI. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what the impact of surveillance is on the surveilled.
Where do you want me to start? I mean, the reality is, if I cut right to the bottom line, there is no privacy anymore. If I take the NSA perspective, there is no privacy. In fact, privacy is in the way of collecting massive amounts of data. And so what happened after 9/11 is that 9/11 became the trigger event because it was a failure to keep people out of harm's way, even though the system was blinking red and there was all kinds of intelligence that said it was going to happen. Instead of actually considering their own culpability, even though it was a systemic failure, under the excuse and the failure that they did not keep people out of harm's way, they decided to then, in the deepest of deep state secrets, along with the torture regime, decided to implement, on the approval of President Bush, with a single piece of paper with his signature. That's how sensitive this program was. They didn't even give a copy of it to the lawyers at NSA. They decided to unleash, without anybody else's knowledge except for a very small handful of people, a program in which the vast power of NSA, which historically was supposed to only be outward-facing to collect intelligence, all types of electronic signals intelligence, on foreign nations, generally avoiding, with some exceptions, your friends and allies. But you have to remember the period in which NSA was formed was in just after the end of World War II, in the early 50s, 1952. It was not authorized by Congress. This is a misunderstanding of how NSA came about. It was literally signed into creation, not law, an executive signature that came from the ink of a pen held by President Harry S. Truman. And in fact, for decades, the original mission statement of NSA was top secret. That's why we euphemistically used to call NSA no such agency. Never say anything. But then, of course, later it was no secrets anymore. So this program, because I was there, I was eyewitness to the epigenesis of what later was the metastasization of it with all this, the extraordinary Snowden disclosures. I was there at the beginning, even though this program actually was in place prior to 9/11, but it was incredibly narrowly scoped under another executive order. They decided that the vast power of NSA, because of the failure to keep people out of harm's way, would now be turned on the US, literally putting equipment. I used to be very involved in the tech side, network side of the burgeoning, digital internet, putting equipment that was on US networks to collect, and I'm not kidding you, because this became the mantra, to collect it all. Everything, wherever possible. And if you couldn't get access to it, then make special backroom arrangements, and there was an office at NSA, still exists, make special arrangements with US corporations and others to gain access to all the data they had. And think about what that might mean, right? Because now anybody, potentially, in terms of a communication, could be suspicious. Phone numbers, emails, etc. That began rapidly metastasizing over the intervening months and years. The field exercise for this trying out all kinds of things. If people remember, and this, for me, it's hard to believe, and this is where I, like almost 25 years ago, my first day on the job was 9/11, the field exercise was to actually try out what this would look like behind the scenes, and under the excuse of what was in the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, they went full up. And so there was no privacy, there was no Fourth Amendment, and this program remained secret for well over 4 years. Now, I found out about it and started blowing the whistle within days of 9/11 because I was seeing this equipment, hearing about this equipment, people coming to me say, what are we doing? We're supposed to have a warrant. This goes back, Chip, and I'll stop, because I grew up in the 1970s. I was there when a president of the United States resigned his office. I remember the church committee hearings in which NSA had secret programs, one of them was called Minaret, spying on certain others in the United States, in which were considered to be domestic threats, and another program called Shamrock, which existed for decades, where every single telex telegram was being conveniently bundled by those corporations and just handed over to NSA.
And a lot of the Minaret surveillance was driven by the FBI. We have now declassified Hoover's in surveillance instructions to the NSA head from that period. They're on the Library of Congress website. They're also on the Mary Farrell website, and they're quite interesting because they're quite Hoover-esque, right? He's asking the NSA for surveillance on black extremists. That was a recurrent one, and that is, of course, the theme today as well. Now that we've set the stage with what the stakes of surveillance are, I want to talk a little bit more about what WikiLeaks has revealed about surveillance. Katharine, my next question is for you. What do you think has been the most important impact of WikiLeaks revelations concerning intelligence and cyber surveillance, and why are those impacts still relevant and important today?
Well, before I head up in that direction, I just wanted to add the UK perspective on the surveillance thing, because much like the FBI was doing, the UK had for many years a program where the police force, the Special Metropolitan Police Force, was spying on, again, individuals or groups of people who were considered to be problematic, but they were, very innocuous, most of them. They were, the animal rights, like you said, anti-hunt type activists. There were the nuclear disarmament, the CND crowd. There were a whole bunch of people, and they sent special undercover agents, police officers, into these groups and this is what the FBI does as well, right? And they go into the groups, and this was going on for many, many years, and some of these police guys married women who were in these groups, had children with them, and then when they felt like they, were bored, they didn't want to lead this kind of boring life anymore, they just up and left. They just literally walked away, and sort of faked a mental breakdown or something. And then women had no idea, and they thought their husband, had really had a mental breakdown or gone off with another woman or something. And then later, many, many years later, they discover that these guys were actually police officers. Now, that situation has been going through, there's an inquiry at the moment in the UK. It's a very lengthy process, and they're interviewing a lot of these guys, and they're sort of giving all their excuses, or most of them say, oh, well, don't know, can't say. And it's this whole process where real people's lives have been turned upside down by the establishment, the police force, deciding that these people, not just the police force, it comes from above, of course, from the Home Office, that these people need targeting. But what's even more concerning is a process that happens in the UK and happens in many countries, which is the government is caught doing something it shouldn't be doing, it's illegal, and then they subsequently go ahead and legalize it. So it's a term that an academic has coined called legalizing law. It's a legal act which very few people know about called Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act, the CHIS Act, which was passed round about 2020 as security threats. So this is the extent to where this surveillance has got to in the UK. Your other question, sorry.
That was excellent. That was very important. That was excellent.
Okay.
What was a patently Fourth Amendment violating, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act violating set of behaviors by the US government because they knew it violated the law, but once it was exposed, they went then legalized it, so it was all now lawful.
And then in 2007, they passed the FISA Amendments Act, which legalized, in quotations, much of it. At the time, there was a presidential candidate named Barack Obama who promised to vote against any law that included immunity for the telecoms. He voted for this law, even though it included, and I assume, I don't want to make an assumption as an American about someone else's country, but I assume in the UK as well.
No doubt. Yeah, well, I've come to the conclusion over the last 25 years that the intelligence services, they work for the established order, and that's the bipartisan, behind-the-scenes sort of juggernaut that pushes forward foreign policy objectives. Now, across both parties, you know, they might differ on the sort of domestic policies to some extent, but the foreign policies, if you look at the historical trajectory of virtually all countries, their foreign policies are virtually identical, regardless of what party pushes.
And in the United States, our Senate did an investigation called the Church Committee, and they made the same conclusion. They concluded that the purpose of the FBI counterintelligence programs were because the FBI viewed itself as the guardians of the status quo and established social order. And you want to look like
Chip, it goes even further than that. I'll just briefly, because when I confronted, my moment of truth is when I actually confronted the lead counsel. He was bred in, they call it read into this secret program, mass surveillance program. And he said, "You don't understand, Mr. Drake." He actually referred to the Constitution that I took an oath to support and defend as a quaint historical document. It was no longer in force because, and this is the phrase he used with me, I still shudder every time I say this phrase, exigent conditions apply. Emergency conditions are now extant. National security takes priority, takes primacy over even the Constitution. And then I said, well, wait a minute. You know, we're supposed to be a nation of laws. No one is above the law. I thought we learned that lesson from President Nixon. And I said, then go back to Congress and change the law. He said, nope, if we go to Congress with what we want to do, which they were already starting to do, they'll say no. And that's when the hair went up on the back of my head, because I realized at that moment, we were no longer in a nation of laws. We were in an entirely different vehicle, and the wheels had come off.
But I appreciate the post-mortem on the the country formerly known as the United States in respect to their simulation of a democratic system. But from today's outer space perspective, all that little details you just mentioned, Trump would just fix with a presidential order, and that's it. So a presidential executive order. I apologize, my French. What the fuck? The question I would like to bring on the table is, because my personal hope that you'll be able to fix the situation in your beautiful country on the other side of the water is not so great. Now, in theory here in Germany, we have constitutional rights, we have administrative courts, we have all this beautiful propaganda making us believe it's all good here. When I also worked with Spiegel and others on the Snowden revelations. We got all the documents and had asked ourselves, what's the impact on Germany? We found this Merkel thing and so on. Now, next to many layers of abstraction that Germany, it turns out from a media perspective, when you report about this, 60 million people are being surveilled, no one understands this. But Merkel, her phone calls intercepted, people are upset. It's really strange how the lack of ability to abstract complex technology into your own life is like lacking impact. However, we also ask ourselves, well, of course, German foreign intelligence works closely with NSA. German federal police works closely with FBI. It can't be that they are blind, right? And it turns out they enjoy that these partner agencies can do things they can't do, and so they circumvent the law. The only thing that leaves me here then at the end of this outer space intervention here is, okay, we need to take things in our hand, and the idea of digital sovereignty, well, okay, as long as you're in Google and exchange your thoughts over US platforms, well, don't even think about doing anything. But in theory, the moment is pretty good, as your beautiful presidency over there and the madness that's being outrolled should make it pretty clear to any governments of this planet that you can't be dependent on that framework. So I don't know if you can contribute to it, but I'm wondering what you would advise to other countries or to people who don't want to be part of this. I think you call them targets, right? Wasn't that the term for human beings in the databases? Or so how would you advise to proceed if you're not in the United States, maybe, or in any other way want to make some sense out of this?
Yeah, it's a multifaceted question. I think it's a multi-pronged approach that we have to take. Ultimately, those of us in the space who occupied seats in the halls of power, for me, like I don't believe in a kinder, gentler FBI, that it can be reformed. I don't believe that the CIA one day will have an epiphany and realize, hey, we should stop, we should stop engaging in coups and destabilizing foreign governments and
no fairy tales anymore.
Yeah, I think there's an inherent fallacy, right, that exists where we look to these institutions to reform themselves, but ultimately, through this conference and sort of everyone here today, right, there's this, I think, deep-seated understanding that we have to be the architects of our own liberation, that we have to actively do what we can in our spaces, wherever it exists, right, to hold the system accountable, to say things unapologetically like free Palestine and face the consequences. Face the consequences of those actions, whatever they may be, because again, in some spaces it's very unpopular and you can be subjected to criminal action, sanctioning from your employer, whatever it is. One of my favorite movies is V for Vendetta, and there's a line in there, and it talks about how people should not be afraid of their government, that the government should be afraid of the people. And
I believe that's actually Thomas Paine originally.
Well, it's from the movie, but
I believe it's in the movie.
That's my frame of reference, but you're right. But in terms of what we do collectively to transform our society, we have to take action however we can within the confines of this very oppressive system, and ultimately be the architects of our own freedom. So.
Yeah, Chip,
I mean, it doesn't sound like you're discussing this with Peter Thiel directly, huh?
It's very difficult for me, and for me it gives me an opportunity to be very introspective and reflective because I'm here in Berlin. I used to fly along what used to be the East-West German border. I used to fly in the Baltic, listening in on the Warsaw Pact. And all I can say right now, I'm increasingly, and I pause because it's really personal, I no longer recognize my own country anymore. To say that I'm an American in many respects is actually shameful for me personally, because America is an empire and it's out of control. And it is time, way past time, that we're now going to have to stand up against a lot of odds and a lot of power that's anti-human and anti-life, and reclaim the essential core and heart of who we are as human beings.
So I do want to go back to the question about WikiLeaks. Not that this has not been very interesting. If anyone on the panel wants to touch this one, which of the WikiLeaks-related revelations have had the most lasting impact on the intelligence agencies and how private companies now operate online surveillance and data collection? I'm not techie either.
I'll answer this in a different way.
Sure.
I think for me specifically with WikiLeaks, I found it to be a very inspiring organization. I remember my days in the FBI, and when the revelations first came out and our security officer released a memo and said, if you view this at work, if you view it at home, it is a security violation, you will be sanctioned, you can face professional repercussions. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, like, well, I'm going to be at my home, and this is newsworthy, this is powerful. The US government just murdered a massive amount of people gleefully, and nothing is done about it. And so, WikiLeaks, and I think Jack touched on this in the last panel, becoming the furniture, right, that is there to establish the historical record of what this system is capable of. And I think it's incredibly valuable, the role that WikiLeaks played and set that stage. And again, we talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Ellsberg, his disclosures, and if there had been a WikiLeaks at the time, how that would have played out. But sort of, I'm confident that the men and women who played a pivotal role in the foundation of WikiLeaks took great comfort in seeing Ellsberg and his example and the courage of disseminating those documents on this massively illegal and unethical war that was being waged on innocent people in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And so I think we have to, take comfort in that and be inspired and sort of use that in an instructive way, however we can, to carry forward that legacy and honor the sacrifice of those who made these documents, made this media organization possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about Ellsberg, and I will note that Ellsberg's original intent was he wanted the Pentagon Papers to be available to everyone and read by everyone. And the New York Times and other publications did not print the entire papers. A Senator, Mike Gravel, enters them into the congressional record, and then the WikiLeaks of the time, Beacon Press, which was a Unitarian Universalist publisher, is the only publisher in the U.S. that would publish the Pentagon Papers, like the whole papers, because there was still a lot of fear that you'd be prosecuted for doing so. So I think it was Carrie Shankman, who's written the best book on the Espionage Act, who stated that, WikiLeaks really was the model that Ellsberg had intended, and that only this small Unitarian press had played of. So I do think it's a really important thing to think about.
Hey, Chip?
Yes, of course, Tom.
Yeah, for me, I can tell you, it's just the mere fact that WikiLeaks existed was an earthquake under the United States government and the national security state, period. Because they didn't know where all this was coming from. They didn't know who else might leak to WikiLeaks, and they became target number one. We have got to shut them down. This is even before 2010. There was already people working for the government in the shadows already strategizing about how to shut WikiLeaks down.
You're talking about the Army counterintelligence memo, correct?
Well, also some of the other corporations that were being contracted by the government.
And I think it's worth mentioning that 2008 Army counterintelligence memo, because it mentions other countries like North Korea and Israel have blocked people from reading WikiLeaks, but they didn't want it in the US. And what they saw as the strategy was that if they destroy the sources, either through getting them fired or prosecuted or sued, WikiLeaks could not exist. This is 2008. It is 2 years for your prosecution. And it really shows that the government understands, although in the opposite way, the same way our friend Jesselyn Radick understands, that the war on whistleblowers is a backdoor war on journalism. So from day one, the government realized the way you get rid of WikiLeaks is you attack any sources.
But see, they couldn't shut down WikiLeaks. Because WikiLeaks was far stronger than even the US government. They continue to exist. So now we got to go after the sources. But it was contemporaneous with me because I was charged in April with a 10 felony count indictment, 5 counts under the Espionage Act. Right after that is when the military version equivalent of the Espionage Act is when Chelsea Manning was charged. And then it just ballooned from there. Oh. So to shut out the sources as a way to not only send a message, but to keep organizations, even other papers, whether it was US or foreign, or even including WikiLeaks, from publishing any of that.
And it's very clear to me that this strategy has had an impact. If you go back to 1975, maybe, the House publishes its version of the Church Committee report, the Pike Committee report, and the executive branch says, no, this is how the executive branch can censor Congress. I don't know, but that's a discussion for a different panel. Says, no, you can't publish this. It immediately leaks to the Village Voice. 40 years later, we see the same thing with the Senate torture report. That has never leaked, ever. And I think it would have a decade or two ago, but people are so afraid. Katharine, you blew the whistle on the run-up to an illegal war. We are now in an illegal war again in Iran, once again started by my government. When we see whistleblowers sort of persecuted, when we see this high level of surveillance that allows them to find whistleblowers, what do you think is the impact of that on people who want to come forward about this war, and how does that sort of rob us of our ability to have a democratic conversation about foreign policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, whistleblowing in the UK is pretty rare in the National Security Service because there is no defense in the UK. There is no defense under the Official Secrets Act. So like in my case, when they did eventually decide to prosecute me, because it took them 8 months before they decided to prosecute me, I couldn't really argue that I wasn't guilty, even though I did intend to argue that I wasn't guilty because I didn't feel guilty at all. And they dropped the charges against me precisely because I think they were very wary that if a jury had decided not to convict me against the orders of the judge, then that would have set a legal precedent in the UK, which would have allowed a chink into the Official Secrets Act, whereby subsequent potential whistleblowers would have some sort of potential legal advice. So by dropping the charges against me, that was never established in court. And furthermore, what the British government has continued to do is to tighten the Official Secrets Act, and they've brought in another act, the National Security Act, which literally is more like the Espionage Act in the US, which penalizes anybody from holding information, including journalists. And it also has, implications for foreign nationals as well. So it's a very, even more draconian type of law, and so really it takes a very brave, well, okay, I'm not patting myself on the back here, but
but it is very brave. Having interviewed many whistleblowers,
I wasn't
it is very brave.
thinking about myself at the time.
But you were very brave, though.
I was very naive, and there really aren't very many people coming forward in the UK, which is very disturbing to me, because I feel like a lot of people do actually care. They're just too afraid to come forward, and understandably so. But I think, in some ways you have to do, in a way, I mean, I don't know if I'm being a bit, again, naive, but by telling my defense team that I didn't feel guilty and that I was prepared to go all the way and defend myself in the public court, that threatened them to some extent, So I feel like people should be brave and take the fight to them, because they're just bullies. That's really what they are. They're completely out of control bullies. Mm-hmm. And if you refuse to kowtow to them bullying, they don't like that at all. And the worst they can do is destroy you. But if you're prepared to
104 years in prison, bankruptcy, yes, worst they can do, yes.
No, but I think, look at the Palestinians who are basically, they're not leaving their land no matter what people are doing to them. And we have to take courage from people like that, because what does it matter if they sack you from your job? What does it matter? And look at Julian Assange. What does it matter if you spend 10 years confined into a cell 5 foot by 6 foot? I mean, there's a limit to what they're doing to us, and they've gone way past that limit, and it's time for everybody to just say no.
Andy, I believe you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the little experience we had measured in impact on the surveillance, obviously in 2017 with the Vault 7 CIA material and Pompeo's speech in April 2017 that WikiLeaks declared a hostile intelligence organization. Yeah, the impact was pretty crass in respect to that. Now they were really on everybody, surrounding everybody who ever visited Julian and so on. And it was no more possible to travel even from the airport to the embassy without 3 people. I created traffic jams in one-way streets at 3 o'clock in the night. It was completely ridiculous. Well, somehow we survived it, but there was quite some unpleasantry, I would say, and it was maybe interesting to see that at that case, other governments saw it as well. And so this is maybe the one lessons learned I want to share. In such a situation, why even try to hide? Forget it. Openness is the best protection here. So, and we were openly criticizing the CIA for its lawlessness in respect to using electronic devices to not only spy on people, but to potentially kill them. Now this public debate is always a question of waves. They come and go, and then something else happens, and the debate is out of the window. But the point was somehow taken, and I had the impression without that I have proof of it, but I had some indications that other governments also indicated, hey, you can't just kill people because you don't like them. That's not how it works. And we had some tough situations, and that's what you have to calculate in the game. So it's not all a pleasant ride on a bicycle in a forest when you're up to revealing some secrets of governments.
Tom and Terry, I wonder if you have any perspectives on our current moment, which seems like a moment in which we desperately need a Dan Ellsberg or a Chelsea Manning, and what this sort of normalization of the Espionage Act in the U.S. means for that. I mean, will we see one? Or have they just scared everyone?
I mean, I think there's been a massive coordinated attack on those in the national security arena to create a climate of fear. Those of us who have been sanctioned and penalized serve as very effective poster children. And so I think in that way they've succeeded, but conversely, there's a critical role for the community of which we are all a part in playing, where it's very important that the example, the stories of, again, as you said, the Chelsea Mannings, the Daniel Hales, who did sacrifice themselves and their careers to be supported and to have a community that recognizes it and tells that story in a way that doesn't stop after the disclosures and the stories are written and the prizes are awarded for this compelling piece of journalism. There's still the human there that needs to be acknowledged, and the impact and the role that this transformative event had in terms of their lives. And so I think in doing that, you know, we all play a role in creating the environment for the next group of whistleblowers who feel compelled and encouraged and supported in making those sacrifices.
Go ahead, Don. Go ahead.
I was an insider. I was living deep in the Leviathan, and I could not have lived myself if I didn't stand up and speak out. I couldn't live myself. I remained silent. And if I had remained silent, then I would have put myself in a place where I would actually violate the oath I took, not to the president, not to NSA, not to secrecy, not to corruption, not to lawlessness. And if I had remained silent, I would have been complicit in crimes committed by the state, which would make me an accessory. And so I chose to stand up and speak out, knowing, because Daniel Ellsberg was my shining example, I consider him my whistleblower father, from when I was a very young teenager, watching what happened to him occur on the front pages of newspapers, that there are people who are willing to sacrifice their life if necessary and spend, as he did, facing 115 years in prison, as I did, and others facing many, many years and decades, even decades in prison. And I continue to speak out, as do others, because we do stand on all the people who have stood up against the abuse and a misuse of power. This pattern has existed for centuries and millennia. There's nothing actually new about this except in terms of scale and scope. So it actually, for me, it now moves to the rest of humanity. Is there enough of us left? Is there still a remnant willing to stand up for what it means to be a human being, willing to stand up and exercise their own agency, willing to stand up and defend autonomy, willing to stand up and defend their own privacy, not just for themselves, but for others. Because there are forces and there are powers out there who, in essence, oligarchs and others, who would rather we end up in some kind of weird techno-fascist feudal world. And I, having lived in that world for a number of years and didn't end up in prison and sit here in front of you as a free human being, I can't begin to tell you what that means. I don't want anybody else. There's been too many people killed. There's been too many people murdered in the name of all kinds of things. Just because they look different, just because they act different, just because they don't live in the right place in the world, or we used to live there, or we used to own it, or my ancestor was here. I saw what happened in the United States, sticking the indigenous peoples on reservations. It is time to stand up and say enough is enough. Period.
Thank you for that, Tom. Thank you. I think we all think that was very moving. Andy, I have a question for you since you brought up Peter Thel earlier. I assume he was invited to the panel but could not make it. We are seeing more surveillance by proxy today, governments outsourcing data collection and analytic work to private tech firms. How does this shift change the way whistleblowers and investigative journalists must operate? And what are the accountability gaps this creates?
Oops. I mean, the Palantir software environment that Peter Thiel has created and his idea and the appliances, for example, for the ICE in the United States, identifying people's patterns, behaviors, movements, and then choosing those who, for some reasons, are up for some arrest or for being beaten up or expelled. That's a pretty totalitarian mindset that comes there, and unfortunately it comes on a scalable technology. So it's no more, the bottleneck is no more the amount of data you can process, it's just the amount of prison cells you have and law enforcement officers who do the dirty work. And the trouble is a little bit that what we are currently seeing is, of course, also the AIanization, so to say, of other technologies, so where the access to people's habits, data, questions, lifestyles, and whatever, it's all there. So this is unfortunately slightly dystopian where this leads to. And now, as an investigative journalist, of course, you know, we can expose things, but the difference here is a little bit that the original hope was maybe, hey, we point out some dangers that new technologies and some commercial players bring into the democratic societies, and we have to contain these dangers and have to, you know, update the laws maybe that this doesn't happen. But this type of beautiful democratic theory is currently not what will work in many countries, as the fascism is open and the idea of, hey, we will use this to, you know, solve the problems and the enemy is there and we are overrun by, and then come all these racist comments and so on. This is pretty crass. So I'm not sure we are at the point where warning or where updating of democracies is the only path. Suna mentioned yesterday a very important aspect is that there might be situations where we cannot intervene, but we can document. We can document as war crimes and other activities against human interest have no status of limitations, be it legally or otherwise. So, but it's a bit really of a big question of what do you want to do when they have the technology, the law enforcement guys, they're all scared about their job. The US military is what we would call in Europe partly the social welfare system. So if you have no money, there's no social welfare system. You go to the army you kill some people to make a living and feed your children. It sounds brutal, but that's how it is for many there. And so I don't have a very good answer on how to avoid this, but I think that we all have the option to opt out, to not use this technology, and to also decide to live in a more peaceful way where we do not engage and support wars in any way. And I mean, because it ends up in wars at the moment, right? It's no more the status, oh, we have some conflicts and there might be some struggles or some tensions or so. It's going really drastically in the military confrontational way, also inside of societies. So I'm sorry, I don't have this super positive vision here of how things go, but maybe the others have nicer answers, so someone from the audience or so.
I want to turn to Tom on this question because the National Security Agency is heavily privatized. I think that started when you were there and it's only gotten worse since you've left. What does the privatization of surveillance mean for accountability, for whistleblowing, or for just democratic checks?
Less.
Okay. Terry, do you have any thoughts on privatization? I don't know.
One word.
One word. That's I think that's the shortest answer I've ever heard you give in the 10 years of these panels we've been doing together.
I had to learn to post on social media, and it was really difficult to cram everything into 150 words, maybe less letters.
I think the one time I interviewed you were supposed to do 30 minutes. We ended up doing 2.5 hours together, so I can imagine how social media was for you.
So less is more here.
I like it more, though. I like it more, not less. Terry, let's hear from you on the issue of privatization of surveillance.
You know, I think one concept is worth addressing is sort of surveillance capitalism and the role of the private and public sector in advancing a lot of these issues that we're addressing today. You know, you mentioned Peter Thiel and you know, a lot of those software tools and the way in which they are fashioned and utilized internally within these agencies and then sort of exported on a massive scale around the globe is something to really be mindful of. But I think, you know, to your point, Tom, is yes, less is really ultimately the answer.
But I do have a quote.
I would love a quote.
So right after 9/11, as the NSA workforce, as they were called, the ones who are doing the real work on the front lines, the quiet sentinels, attempting to provide for the common defense under the preamble of the Constitution, going around, my boss was the head of the Signals Intelligence Directorate, the largest single organization at NSA, worldwide mission. And people were really like, we knew we had failed. They knew that. But she said, and I was there to hear it, and it was widely shared. In response to it was a failure, she says, no. 9/11 is a gift to NSA. We will get all the money we want and then some. Speaking of privatization.
And unfortunately, I think that was an attitude throughout the U.S. government. I mean, again, I don't want to keep going back to the FBI, but that is my area of expertise. You know, the big thing that happened after 9/11 was the FBI said we're no longer a law enforcement agency that prosecutes crimes after the fact. We're an intelligence agency that prevents them before they happen. But the preventative model of counterterrorism emerges in the mid-'70s from people who are angry that the McCarthy and Hoover-type organs have been shut down. And this is not me exaggerating. This is not me speculating. There are documents from the Heritage Foundation, which is very influential in U.S. security policy, stating that we've shut down the 37-year investigation into the Socialist Workers' Party. They were very upset that after 37 years, they could no longer investigate the Socialist Workers' Party. We've gotten rid of the House Un-American Activities Committee. We've shut down local red squads. We are now no longer safe from terrorism. We have to bring these things back in the name of preventing terrorism. And in the Church Committee report, Barry Goldwater gives a dissent where he uses preventing terrorism as the rationale. And in the 70s, people were talking about the future of counterterrorism being the means for surveilling people. And of course, after 9/11, they get that wish list, just like Cheney gets his war with Iraq. We're almost time for questions from the audience, so I'm going to give the panel one last question for each of you. And I'll start with Katharine, since we haven't heard from you for a minute. If the panelists were advising civil society actors or journalists today, what are the most urgent surveillance-related issues that need to be exposed, challenged, or regulated right now, whether in Europe, the US, the UK, or elsewhere? And what more should journalists and civil society groups be doing to expose intelligence and cyber surveillance abuses?
Well, I think the most important thing right now is the war in Iran and the extent to which our governments are supporting this effort. And in the UK, there are journalists who've been trying to expose the extent to which British air bases are being used by the US military to load bombers to fly over to Iran. And, you know, these Air Force bases are literally just a stone's throw from where people live. And if this war accelerates and widens into a much bigger world war, heaven forbid, then, you know, bases here in Germany, bases in the UK, bases all around Europe that are close to where people live are going to be targets. And unless people start thinking like this, you know, you think, oh, it's happening over there, you know, it's got nothing to do with us. It can always spiral rapidly out of control before you notice. So it's the time to act was yesterday. Get on it now.
Andy, do you have thoughts on this one?
Yes, I think that's a very helpful perspective on it. Another aspect is unfortunately that in the cyber domain, the so-called false flag operations, so the ability to simulate that Russia attacks Germany, that Iran attacks England or whatever, that's all in the programs of the cyber warfare departments of the governments worldwide, but namely the biggest one, the US government. So the ability to create a conflict or to escalate a conflict or to say we had to counter-attack that country as it was attacking our infrastructure, that's a matter of seconds and the permission to engage, as it's called. So this is slightly worrying as the ability to really review the evidence is then extremely limited, and digital data, as we all know, can be forged in any way, so it's really tricky, and then you have to trust this type of few experts that unfortunately have conflict of interest as they come from the same institutions that you're just trying to evaluate if they're telling you the truth, or they mainly work for them. So this is, we're really running into muddy waters here a little bit. And so I would think it will be very important to stay a little bit, common sense and sanity is difficult as a recipe without pronouncing it clearly. But why should we trust those institutions that try to protect us from the dangers we wouldn't have without them? That's kind of the basic.
Harry.
Yeah, you know, I think one other critical point to recognize is we need to stop, or collectively those that have the power to hold the systems to account need to stop using the language. You know, during the Bush regime, you know, they would use words like enhanced interrogation, you know, rendition, sanitizing very egregious actions. And we have to really confront that and speak in plain English. Kidnapping, torture, right, murder, Again, yesterday we talked about the language with the WikiLeaks video and referring to it as collateral murder, right? Language is so powerful and very important in really forming the collective consciousness of the public. And so I think that's one role that we should definitely focus on.
And then we're going to let Tom answer the question, then we're going to open the floor for questions and answers.
I'm going to answer in a very different way, and it's in a direct appeal to this audience and everybody that's listening and whoever will listen online as well as in the future. I remember at 11 years of age, in December 8th of 1968, Apollo 8. Apollo 8, when it came around the backside of the moon, there was that extraordinary picture that was taken of Earthrise. I remember as a kid, arrested by the view of the Earth, this extraordinary jewel of a planet against the inky blackness of space. And time stopped, because I recognize I'm looking back on the very planet, third rock from the sun, in a solar system that's on an outer arm of a galaxy called the Milky Way, and a vast sea of galaxies, and much larger, going across billions and billions, umpteen billions of light years. And all I remember, and to this day, it's as present to me now as it was in 1968 as an 11-year-old, is this is a privileged planet. It is a pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan described it, with Voyager making its way through the solar system and looking back. That is our planet. And when you look at the planet, there are no borders, there are no boundaries, there are no individual races or tribes. It is one world. It is about time to shift the conversation completely. That we no longer learn about war anymore, that we give up the instruments of power and surveillance and generate something completely new. Because as I stand here or sit here right now, there are a lot of event horizons that we face on this extraordinary planet called Earth. It is our only home. And it's about time we start taking care of it. Not just for us, but for all generations yet to come.
Tom, as a fellow American, I'm obligated. Would you like to be our president? I think you'd do a better job than any of the candidates I've seen in my lifetime. So now we're going to open the floor to questions. At one of these things once, I made a joke. I'm going to open the floor to questions, comments disguised as questions, and sectarian denunciations in the room. And the very first person I called on had a newspaper he was selling and denounced everyone in the room. So I will never make that joke again. I'm opening the floor to questions now. The woman in that row right there. I think, yes, you, yes. And I apologize if I misidentify your article of clothing. I can see nothing but glaring light. You're all just sort of blurry people out there.
It's fine. Famous German comedians, moderators, and reporters recently created an independent news format and streams it outside of big tech platforms, advertises it on Mastodon, etc. It is called Fun Facts, and it's in German. And I think they implement a very important consequence of WikiLeaks, because at the end of every episode they say, and now put your phone down and go do something beautiful. My question is, what do you think about training the general public to drastically reduce their presence around phones? Would that be an effective way to protect switches and capacities again? And go a bit backwards to escape the reach of mass surveillance? And how about building collective decentralized communication technology?
Yeah, I love that. I made a similar suggestion some years ago on another conference to create something like an offline day, at least once per year, where we all try to not use any electronic communication device, but realize each other and talk to each other. And now I heard there's first offline cafes. So yes, we need these concepts to reestablish, because in my world, we created the internet. Like, we had all these good intentions to, we had these dreams of countries would overcome cultural boundaries by being better networked, and world peace would be established by the unrequirement of governments to in between the citizens and all their military gears. And then came, other players, and today these devices are often in between humans. And now with the platforms monetizing the data streams, bringing advertising in, with the AI bringing even agendas into the dialogues, where translations can have minimal small differences and lead to other interests and to another tone in communication, subtle little changes. That's all not helpful. So yes, I love this idea.
Anyone else want to take that one? Okay, I think there was a question in the front row. Right-hand side, front row.
Hi. I'm going to follow with the leftist Berlin tradition of making a statement before a question. But I wanted to clarify a couple facts with Mr. Terry Albury. So my question is to you. I mean, you're my personal hero. Me and Daniel Ellsberg, we had many chats about you, and you're fucking incredible. You're like, not only are you a fucking sexy hunk of a man in a suit with a free fucking Palestine button on, I mean, you know, before Daniel...
I did not see this question going that direction, but...
Well, the fact that an American doesn't see something coming is not news to anybody in this fucking room, Chip.
Okay.
Look, my point here is Daniel Ellsberg and I, we spoke about you, and we both agreed you are marginalized. And I want to say thank you for your whistleblowing and for the documents you are accused of leaking. I'm not trying to get you to confirm you did leak them or not. I've read every single...
Allegedly.
Yeah, I've read every single document that I understand you're accused of leaking. Not only because you went to prison for us to know these facts you thought we should know, but also that. And I'm really deeply sorry that The Intercept threw you under the bus through their incompetence. And I want to tell you that I warned the people at The Intercept about printer dots and how that will put sources in danger. And I find it very suspect that they ignored this as a threat to source protection. And at least you and Reality Winner, I believe, were put in prison by The Intercept being a bunch of fucking morons. But actually, I think they're what are called useful idiots. I think they knew this, and they allowed you to come to harm. And I think that they should be held accountable for that. You should never leak to The Intercept. And I don't think Glenn and Laura actually understood what they helped create. And I just want to say, as someone who interviewed with them and warned them about this, I decided not to take the job because they're terrible. They're not serious people in what they've done. First point. But I understand you went to prison and you lost your pension. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you're still under threat, where the state is watching you to try to put you in prison even now.
You know, for those of us with this specific charge, you know, you live under a perpetual cloud of suspicion. You have to engage in self-censorship quite a bit, lest you run afoul of further unauthorized disclosures. And so, you know, I'm very careful with my words and sort of what I acknowledge. But yes, you know, my act of civil disobedience came with a lot of collateral consequences, one of which also is this perpetual state of scrutiny and surveillance and intimidation by the state. I'm sure they would be more than happy if a bus hit me on the way back to the hotel today because of my continued effort to speak out openly and to challenge their narrative. But again, as all of us here today, you know, there's great energy and just comfort in being in a space like this where so many are committed to that collective cause and recognize the value of, again, the giants on whose shoulders we stand.
I mean, you're a man with a felony. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you had years of life stolen from you and your family by being put in prison. And that means you're a black man on a black list for political reasons where your work, the ability to sell your labor on capitalism, is systematically denied to you. Is that correct? And I noticed that people listing off whistleblowers tend to omit your name and don't mention your documents. And it seems blatantly racist, actually, to me, and potentially self-serving, since your documents cover human infiltration of political targets. Do you think that this is intentional? And do you think your leaks after, even now, after years, that there are lessons for people in this room about human infiltration, undercover people, and the targeting of communities like this? Do you think that happens here? Is it prudence or paranoia to think about that?
That's a complex question. My position has always been not to center myself. What matters most are the issues and the impact of communities. And it's always been my hope that in time, my attorney, Josh Stratel, would always say, things will unfold organically. And I think humans and their capacity for compassion and empathy in time will make those connections. I think there's, one of the elephants in the room, and I was speaking with someone yesterday about this, there's a very deeply ingrained racist, xenophobic, just bigoted view towards those in various countries that are deemed to be others, right? America specifically, in the last 25 plus years, it's been the Muslim community. Prior to that, again, and I think maybe historically, it's been the black community. Prior to that, you had the Chinese community and the Japanese community sort of always being viewed as this existential threat, an enemy within. And I think we have to sort of confront collectively the role that our system of government plays in demonizing and criminalizing the identities of various communities, and then what our role is in sort of benefiting. There's a concept they use, in sociology. They talk about sort of white supremacy and what that means, and sort of, how we benefit, or certain groups benefit sort of from the manner in which certain groups are labeled and demonized and intimidated solely based on race. And so I think we have to sort of, again, expand, and Tom spoke on this, and I thought it was very inspiring and just, powerful, right, of really expanding our definition of what it means to be a human, right? And again, we have our differences, but our differences should not be the sole basis of marginalizing and intimidating and treating people as though they are less than and they have less rights, because again, we all are in this together.
And I do want to...
Thank you again for your sacrifice and your propaganda of the deed. You moved me. You're the only person I've ever heard of that made me think it was worth joining the FBI so I could follow you. Everyone should follow your example. Your propaganda of the deed is powerful, and you have changed the way that we do security because the documents you released tell us the tactics of the oppressor. So thank you so much, Terry, for your sacrifice. And Daniel Ellsberg wanted you to know that he supported you, and I spoke with him, and he was inspired by you, and he was thankful by your example. You follow in his footsteps. Thank you, Terry.
I just want to... I want to say that Terry's case has been shamefully ignored by people who do whistleblower work, who do press freedom work, but there are exceptions. Jesselyn's group, Whisper, and my group, Defending Rights in Dissent, organized a statement in support of Terry that I know Tom signed as soon as he was indicted, so that there were people who have supported all of the whistleblowers without exception. I think they're all in this room right now, which means there's not enough of them. But that if you do care about whistleblowing in the United States, you do care about a principled stance for the First Amendment, you do care about a principled stance against the FBI and the NSA, you should support groups like Jesselyn's Whisper, as well as Defending Rights and Dissent. As well as the Disruption Laboratories who put this on. Yes, support all three. Support them first, though. Yeah, they're in the front row looking at me, so I have to say that. The man in the scarf, I think it's a keffiyeh, but I'm not sure.
And,
are we allowed to have those in Berlin?
We're fighting for it, and
okay.
non-binary.
Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't realize.
It's quite all right. I would like to, so first of all, to say, in this place of celebrating the bravery of people who are willing to sacrifice in the name of what is true, in the name of what is good, and in the name of humanity. Thank you for being the giants on whose shoulders we can stand. And as an important addendum or an important part of, in addition to celebrating the bravery and protecting whistleblowers, a point that has come up many times so far in this event is the feeling of how do we make the public know that there is accountability to be had? How do we make the public know that that there have been consequences of whistleblowing? I feel like perhaps there is a visibility gap, within the people in this room who know that there have been impacts, and the wider public who feel like there isn't a point, especially as we make this call to action to the public to engage and support.
Anyone want to respond to that, or?
Well, I think there's something called subconsciousness, or there's a growing consciousness does not always lead automatically to action, but I think it is very helpful to keep working on the consciousness level, that people have an ability to understand how governments enforce power structures using technology, also against people, and how methods are being also being made available to circumvent these systems and to stay sane. So not everything leads right now, right here, to any kind of revolution or anything, but that's maybe anyhow not the way to go. But to overcome at least the stupid ideas and stop supporting them, that's maybe already part of the solution. So.
Let's go to the back left. There's a person in a mask who I think wants to ask a question.
Hello. Test. So this is a sort of a little bit of a selfish wanting comfort kind of question. But in my mutual aid work, I'm often surprised at how mundane everything is. It's a lot of spreadsheets and emails and a lot of meetings. And I was wondering, a more personal question, in a lot of your high-risk work, have you had any moments where you stop and you think, wow, this is really mundane? Like, you still have to water plants and go on the train or write an email. Have you had moments like that? And does it bring you comfort, or does it disturb you more?
It's funny, the everyday sort of habits of life. I know when I was in my 4-year, 5-year ordeal, by the time it ended, plus, from the time they put me under surveillance, the FBI was tracking me for any number of months, and then some electronic surveillance that was quite extensive. Both during that period and even after, it was sort of the everyday habits of life and connecting with people, communicating with people, that provided sort of that stability, a place where I could go and I could actually feel normal, or I could at least feel my humanity. So I thank you for raising that, because it's incredibly, people appreciate whistleblowers. And we all, I'm looking at Katharine, I'm looking at Terry, and a number of other whistleblowers that are former whistleblowers, and others that aren't here around the world. It's unbelievably isolating. It's incredibly isolating. And you must find ways to connect to who's left, that remnant, again, within your own circles and create new ones. And I was amazed when Jocelyn Radak in particular took on my case as outside counsel against a lot of objections by a lot of others as to why would you want to represent someone who was charged with espionage. Remember, it was the signature case, so it was like he must have done something really bad. It was really important to find people that I didn't know or haven't met. You know who the first person she introduced me to? Daniel Ellsberg. Because it was a universe of one she knew that understood what I was experiencing because he had experienced the same thing 40 years earlier.
It's not an answer to the question, but we've had Dan mentioned twice tonight, both from the audience about his support for Terry as well as his support for Tom. And Dan was phenomenal in his support to other whistleblowers, and I know how much it meant to him to do so, and it is very heartening to hear that he backed Terry, and very heartening to hear that he was the first person, Jesselyn.
And me.
And you, okay. It's not, and Katharine, yes, it's not surprising at all, because I have stories about working with him for Chelsea Manning or Daniel Hale, and his commitment was so strong and his passion was so great, and it really came from his heart. He was an incredibly kind person, and is very sad he cannot be with us tonight. Or, yeah, he passed away several years ago, people who don't know.
The work that I was doing was actually very boring. So surveillance is very mundane, it's very boring, and you're sifting through the most mundane stuff that you can ever dream of, looking for anything that is potentially interesting, and most of the time, none of it's interesting. And, you know, blowing the whistle, I didn't do it for any other reason except for trying to stop the war and to save lives. And then when the case was dropped against me, I could have turned it into a media storm. I could have become some sort of high-profile campaigner, but I wasn't ready. I knew I wasn't ready at the age of 27 or 28, and I'd only been married about a year. I just wanted to lead an anonymous life. And so my biggest fear was having publicity. I didn't want anybody to know who I was. I didn't want anybody to ask me any questions. I didn't want to tell anybody who I was and what I did. I made friends with people, and I'd be friends with them for years before I mentioned the fact that I blew the whistle. And they would be like, oh my gosh, why didn't you tell me earlier? It's not something that I wanted everybody to know about, and it took years and years before I could actually talk about it without getting palpitations. I don't know whether you guys had the same feeling, but the whole experience, you know, people ask me, have I been to a therapist? I've never in my life been to a therapist. It never even occurred to me to go see a therapist. It was a matter of time processing it and just trying to lead a normal life away from any type of scrutiny. That's what I was looking for until I was able to deal with this sort of thing like 15 to 20 years later.
Yeah, you know, I mean, the experience is quite jarring, obviously, you know, when you see an indictment, you know, your name versus the U.S. government, or in your case, in the UK, you know, you don't really have perspective until you look at that, your name, and it's just like, this is a battle of epic proportions. But, you know, I think to your question and just your overall assessment, one thing that I've remained consistent in is the courage of my initial convictions, and to hold fast to that, because I believe the state, they're very intent on forcing us to embrace this idea of failure and to really adopt this notion that, you know, all hope is gone and that we should now have this epiphany and see the error of our ways and bow down at the altar of Big Brother. And in my case, it was quite the opposite. You know, through my incarceration, my subsequent probation, you know, I remained intransigent and really held fast to what motivated me, because the flip side is, again, sort of accepting that and normalizing their narrative, right, that you committed espionage, which is preposterous, right? That you are a criminal as they define it, but you know, the reality is the biggest criminal on this planet is the US government, right? The biggest criminal are the men and, you know, the countries, the institutions that rape, murder, and torture people, whether in places like Palestine, whether in places like Cambodia with Operation Menu and the US government and their bombing campaign, whether the war in Iraq. And so I think it's really important, again, to solidify our resolve and hold fast and not give them the opportunity, right, to cause us to question ourselves and our motivation, because, again, it's altruism in the purest form, in service of something much larger than ourselves.
And then, Andy, do you have a response to that? Or, okay, let's go. There's a person with a question right over here, behind Jesselyn.
Thanks so much for all your courage and deep respects for doing what you've done. But I want to put something into sort of like some strategic thinking input here, and wondering if some of the promise of what the WikiLeaks platform was the potential to create a place where we could all, as citizen journalists, expose things without having to pay the price, remaining anonymous if that's your choice, you know, and maybe even it can be more powerful if it's in an anonymous form, if we're acting as a collective organism rather than individuals trying to stand in front of this mafioso terrorist train that's coming at us, you know. So is there still hope among the people who do the technology of WikiLeaks to like create this platform where we can all contribute to fight against the lies and the bullshit and all the things that we need to bring down in those power structures without having to be martyred for it, without having to pay the price? Can we still do some kind of technological trick to protect so that we can all speak out without having to suffer for doing that?
I mean, anonymity on the internet has become extremely difficult. And the answer, I think, needs to be a decentral one, because if WikiLeaks as a platform, and it has become a little bit prominent, it does also attract the attack. And we had quite some of them. So,
what about if we all just got like pager systems and exchanged information over low-tech devices?
Yeah, the Mossad will happily provide you with a whole boxes full of pages, but I would advise against using them.
Self-made, hacker lab made.
Sure. No, I mean, sure. I mean, I'm exactly from that community. So yes, of course, we have to work on our own infrastructure to provide ourselves the instrument for at least secure communication. Anonymous, I'm not sure, but that was back then before the vast amount of data collection and correlation techniques went to the level where they might not be able to read your messages, but they can timely see that an amount of packages is being sent there and received there, and whatever you do in the middle, the voodoo doesn't really matter because they can say this is the same thing. So there is limitations on what technology can protect you from, but it is absolutely true that not all leaks need a leaker in the sense of not everybody needs to expose himself when he or she is reporting something or submitting something. And that option is still available.
The irony with us is that we end up being exposed either by press or by the government itself, making sure that our names were known. We never intended to be named or become public, like somehow it was us. No, we were just messengers, right? The message was what was important. But to answer your question directly, because there's no security at all in any electronic systems. There's just degrees of insecurity. And what are the attack surfaces, and what is your exposure? What's your risk? There's something to be said. Why did 9/11 happen? Under the radar, as it turns out, because of a cellular structure of an organization that wanted to create a spectacular event, a series of them, that culminated in 9/11. There's something to be said for the analog world. There's something to be said for analog couriers. There's something to be said for just foot traffic, sneaker nets. Forget the electronics. Just courier it. Which is ironic because the original basis for the Espionage Act was if you actually transport something, right, and you give it to somebody, it's not authorized to receive it, that violates the Espionage Act, which is what I was charged with, okay, 5 times over, as Ellsberg was. So I think there's something to be said. I'm going way out of the box here. Forget digital. There could be hybrid systems, but I think there's something to be said for analog. We sort of forget about how do we even communicate. I'm talking to a microphone, you're here in an audience, but you're listening through an analog device, your ears. That's not digital. So consider that as an option.
I think we have time for a few more questions. We have time for one more question. You already asked one, so we're going to give to the person in the hat right there.
You. It's not a question. I want to shine some light on a project of hope and emotional intelligence. So as we all know, the cyber intelligence folks are full of neuroqueer people and individual. And we all need more community and support in this war against LGBT that we see around Europe and in Africa. So my question would be, can supporting LGBT movements and communities around the world right now be an act of resilience and intelligence and do good outside of the digital cage that we have to operate in?
I think to your question overall, the concept of intersectionality is obviously very critical, and collectively, right, we all need to understand that the rights of whether it's the LGBTQ community, whether it's the Muslim community, the African American community, whatever marginalized identity exists, right? Our struggle, it's all connected, right? And I think again, expanding, our consciousness to understand what it means to be human and recognizing the value of everyone is very critical in sort of honoring what you are addressing. Hope that answers your question. Not, I don't know.
There's also questions online.
Yes.
Sorry to cut. Yes.
Online questions.
So surveillance is rationalized by security and plays with people's real fears. Must there be, to counteract the effective mentality of surveillance, a new public understanding of security? Or are there convincing arguments that surveillance is not creating security? What are strategies to counter surveillance without compromising feelings and needs of security?
I think what's missing in that question is the definition of security. I mean, what is security?
Who's security?
Yeah, whose security? Like I used to explain people in the corporate world that if they read the word IT security, they might think it means to protect your data from being manipulated, copied out, stolen, or whatever. If a government uses the word IT security, they mean the ability to control the system, no matter who owns the system. So there's big misunderstandings about the term security if it's used by governments. If we're talking about like national security, for example, is such a term that might be in complete 180 degrees opposition to your understanding of security. So if we're talking about the integrity of our lives, that's maybe then a little bit more precise. So I don't want to say it's a complicated question, but our ability to maintain safe and have integrity in our life will also depend on our understanding of how these monsters agitate and work and how they want to mess up with your life.
Any other thoughts on the question, or?
I thought there was.
No, I said thoughts on the question, not.
For me, real security is who we are as human beings and our own freedoms and liberties and rights. That there's a set of human rights, inalienable set of rights. Those are what actually make us secure. And what's ironic in all of this is the equation has been flipped, where in order to have security, we actually have to sacrifice your liberty and your rights and your freedoms, which makes you less secure.
Any more online questions, or? One? Okay.
How can we break the blacklist against you where people can't hire you because of your felony?
So the question was, how can we break the blacklist, I think against Terry, but I assume also against Tom, maybe, where people cannot hire you because of your felony? I mean, hire them would be the first thing to do. Anyone have a job they want to give them? This is your time.
It's about time we make our own blacklist, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know, I mean, I think it's spaces like this, right, where we have these conversations, and I think the collective consciousness needs to be raised and a recognition made on the value that those of us with this unique perspective, you know, Thomas comes from a very specialized background and has a very unique set of skills that I would say is incredibly valuable, right, in sort of the understanding of sort of these issues. I come with a very unique skill set from my position in the FBI. You know, Daniel Hale, I speak to him quite a bit. He was in the Air Force, and sort of his understanding with the drone warfare program. I think, you know, groups and organizations who care about these issues, who recognize that, you know, we are in for a long fight for our collective freedom, need to step up and, you know, take the action necessary to support those of us or create spaces because, again, sacrifices have been made and there are collateral consequences as a result. And oftentimes, you know, I was speaking with Jesslyn today about Jeffrey Sterling, you know, and you know, there's, again, in the rush to publish a lot of these stories, the individual is oftentimes forgotten and they just become a footnote. Oh yeah, by the way, this story came as a result of XYZ individual. You know, Edward Snowden, I'm sure he is making the most of his life in Russia, but he doesn't want to live there. He would much rather be around his community, around his friends, his family, but he can't. And, you know, he's had to make certain adjustments. Chelsea Manning, you know, she's had to make many different sacrifices and sort of decide how best to navigate this new reality. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a important question, and I don't have the answer. You know, I guess for me personally, what I strive to do is just continue to speak that truth and, you know, find the community in which we are in today, and, you know, again, work to advance that cause.
So I think that's the end of the program. Oh, there's one more question. Okay. One more question.
Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. I just wanted to acknowledge that we mustn't normalize or even accept how you have been treated or how Jeffrey's been treated or indeed other whistleblowers, and Julian, of course. But also perhaps say that it's also time that we acknowledge on our platforms and in our spaces the people who are really suffering in Gaza, in other parts of the world, whose courage and, you know, the journalists in Gaza who have been live streaming what has been going on, they are showing an incredible amount of courage, which some of the hand-wringing in the Western world by journalists is, you know, it makes it so pale so much. And while the rest of us are fighting and it's difficult and it's uncomfortable, we're not being bombed every day. And I think there's something to be said about that.
Yeah, you know, that's a very powerful point you're making. And one of my good friends, her name is Lina Alarian. She's the daughter of Sami Alarian. And if you know the family, they experience really oppressive state-sponsored terrorism against their family. And in the aftermath of 9/11, labeling him, you know, a wide variety of things, and the family, sisters, brothers, everyone had to suffer under the assault of the government. But one thing I learned, you know, in sort of my developing consciousness of the Palestinian people specifically, you know, there's a concept called samud, which it means steadfastness and resilience, right? And I think to your point, right, you know, again, sort of, and that's why, like, my position is not to center myself, right? Because, again, there are people actively suffering under the assault of this system, under the weaponization of these tools by the FBI, MI5, MI6, right? All of these government agencies that are able to normalize such oppressive tactics, Israel, and with the Shin Bet and Mossad, right, actively going and murdering the Palestinian people. And so I think we have to, again, kind of confront those realities and maintain that perspective, right, because there are much deeper issues, and we have a certain privilege, you know, in spite of, you know, the challenges of my journey, right, I still have some privilege. And so using that as a vehicle to, again, elevate and really inform the public collectively on these issues and their importance. So thank you for that.
I think there's extraordinary acts of daily resistance and resilience each and every day. Middle East, Eastern Europe, not too far from here. And in the United States, incredibly set of dedicated people at a community level stood up against ICE and CBP in Minnesota. And you'll never see the individual people behind the scenes that helped organize the rallies, all the food that's distributed, making sure people are being checked in, making sure people are as safe as possible. That made a huge difference It is possible. You can actually stand up against the abuse and misuse of power.
Thank you to our wonderful panelists, Andy, Katharine, Terry, and Tom. We will be back tomorrow night for the third night of the conference, which I believe is behind me. It's at the same time as tonight. That's 17 hours, I think, 17 hours. And we're going to have global economy, and corporate secrets with Matthew Kennard, Scott Ludlam, Esteban Servant, Clara Lopez Rubio, Deepa Govindra-Driver. And then we're going to have art as evidence and resistance with Robert Trafford, Institute for Dissent and Data Love, David Dormino, Manja Makad, Becky Heisman-Shuren. You don't want to miss that. And I've also been instructed to tell you we're all going to the restaurant bar Vu around the corner. So please join us.